Welcome to the 2025 Inclusive Hiring Practice presentation. As we embark on this important talent acquisition journey together, Vanessa and I want to provide this presentation that will support you in the hiring process to ensure that we hire from an inclusive lens while fostering a fair and equitable hiring practice. Here at Key, faculty diversity, cultural inclusiveness, and employment equity are deeply embraced values held at Key School. We are dedicated to providing a diverse educational environment for our students, as well as committed to fostering a diverse and inclusive working community. We also embrace the notion that we can learn from each other's differences and break down the barriers that separate us to make every effort that Key is a place where everyone can feel a sense of belonging. And it starts with exceptional recruiting and hiring practices. This is the reason why being tasked as a hiring committee member is one of the most important roles that you will perform here at Key, as you will be charged with being able to shape our community and cultivate our vision. Thank you, Vanessa, for the video. Inclusive hiring practices are not just about attracting diverse talent. They also involve creating an environment where all employees feel valued and supported. So, therefore, it's about the entire employee's journey here at Key. Think of talent acquisition as acquiring talent. How do we attract candidates? How do we hire? How do we set up someone for success? And how do we retain? Here are some steps to implement these practices effectively. In the next slides, we'll cover from before the search to after the search best practices that can support this process. So, one of the first steps in making sure we have inclusive practices is ensuring that we have a culturally responsive hiring committee. Assembling the right team is key. Having people with differences in perspectives, backgrounds, can support successful recruitment and hiring efforts. Inviting multiple perspectives into the process allows the hiring team to be able to be more effectively and holistically and fairly evaluate a candidate. Here are a few considerations when formulating a cultural responsive committee. One, does the committee member demonstrate a commitment and contribution to the work and initiatives related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? So, does the member seek opportunities and possess an active devotion to the work related to DEIB? Does the committee member possess strong interpersonal skills, including showing the ability to build relationships and can actively listen and collaborate with others? Remember, soft skills are important. Soft skills are just as important as those instructional and technical skills. Are they able to work as a team and collaborate and partner throughout the process? Are they able to communicate with a transparent yet empathetic voice? Do they self reflect and actively listen? Are there different roles or departments that can bring a fresh viewpoint to the process? Are there members of underrepresented groups included in the process that can bring unique perspectives? And then lastly, joy and belonging have been shown to play a role in preparing students and employees up for success. Has the member demonstrated a support for advocating for students and other members of diverse backgrounds and experiences outside of the identities they hold?
So I'm going to read to you and then talk about the words. All search committee members must understand and comply with the requirements of the position being filled, the needs of the department, and the school's mission. All search committees must be fully engaged and invested in promoting diversity and inclusion efforts forward in regard to the hiring and selection. So let's go back and unpack that. When we're talking about the requirements of the position, You have non-negotiables. These are the must-haves in order to be able to do the job. Make sure you're all clear on what those things are before you start the process. Also take into consideration the needs of the department. Who is already there? What do we need to include more voices or representation in that position, in that department, in that division? Think about those things. Also, let's talk about, is the person mission aligned? What does it truly mean to live in a global society? It's not just about you, it's also those that are around you, because that is the type of world we need to be helping our students be able to navigate in the future. So, fully engaged and invested means that you understand, agree, and support the above, because you understand that in order to fill a position with a person that is mission aligned and capable of doing their job, you have to make sure that all of these things are a priority.
So, all members should possess a commitment to our DEIB goals and initiatives and be able to partner in the process. To that end, there are specific roles to ensure these practices are moving efficiently and fairly. So we'll go through the different committee members and the roles that each one will play. The hiring manager or the clerk communicates the guidelines to the committee and makes sure each member understands the charge. Communicate the importance of confidentiality before, during, and after the search. And this is particularly important for internal candidates, those who are employees, parents, and alumni. Ensure that a diversity advocate is selected. Spearhead committee meetings, facilitate schedule, interview questions, and feedback. This is definitely a collaborative process because everyone needs on the committee needs to be involved in creating those questions, interview questions, feedback, creating the rubric. But the hiring manager is going to spearhead that process. And you also want to make sure notes, assessments are completed in an applicant tracking system for from all committee members, or you can use a Google Doc. And this is really important because let's say if we have a candidate that applied to a position and they got to be a finalist in that role, but we didn't offer them the position and they may have attributes for and traits for another role in a different capacity. So it's good to have that documentation on record to see how can we again we're thinking about acquiring talent. So how can we keep that feedback in the system so we know how to subsequently recruit them. Diversity advocate. Diversity advocates will collaborate with the search committee clerk to ensure a commitment to anti-bias practices. The diversity advocate will also must go through an anti-bias training with the director of DEIB. They will also provide feedback to search committees on the scope of the candidate pool as it relates to diversity. They will be aware of unconscious bias and be able to address it with the committee. Ensure the inclusive hiring practice presentation, such as this one, has been watched by all committee members. And lastly, they will work with the Director of Human Resources to collect data on candidate pool diversity during the process. And this is super important because we can explore an assortment of ways that we can attract candidates from diverse backgrounds, whether it is using platform that leverages great exposure to candidates of color and underrepresented groups. And then lastly, the search committee members. So the entire search committee members will adhere to the recruiting guidelines as a team creative rubric. Create structured interview questions to be used by all. And we'll get into the structural process a little bit later, but you definitely want to ask behavioral and situational questions. Attend all scheduled committee meetings. Be an active participant in the search process. Commit to review and comment on applicant resumes in the Clear Company system. And then lastly, you want to uphold confidentiality throughout the entire search process. And so there are other members who play a role in the search process. The Director of Human Resources. So the HR is responsible for overseeing the overall hiring process, ensuring it's compliant, fair, and diverse, as well as to ensure there's an alignment with institutional needs and mission. The Director of DEIB is specifically focused on identifying and mitigating bias in the recruitment practices to guarantee fair treatment and opportunity for all candidates, promoting equity throughout the selection process. And then lastly, the head of school. So every finalist will meet with the Director of Human Resources, the Director of DEIB, and the head of school. So the head of school makes the final decision and offer, including the compensation package. And other members who can be a part of the search process. So students. So selected students may be involved in meeting the candidates to provide insight of the school and to engage and provide feedback in the candidate's demo lesson activity. And although it's rare, parents can also be involved. However, parents may be asked feedback in situations where the school is seeking to understand the needs and perspectives of the student body, which could indirectly influence the selection of new faculty members.
All right, so how exactly can we avoid unconscious bias when we're reviewing candidates? Here is a video clip, and it's going to give you some very practical strategies for inclusive hiring practices. While you watch, please notice any practices that you already use or think of any that you can include or strengthen.
So we all have unconscious biases. It's what makes us human. Some ways that we can mitigate those biases when it comes to hiring are actually creating objective processes for how we evaluate talent. So being really clear about what it is that we're looking for before we even evaluate candidates, and then measuring each candidate against those objective criteria equally. Creating a rubric for how we evaluate answers. What does a really strong answer look like? What does a really poor answer look like? How can we evaluate everyone on that same scale? There's also ways that you can make sure that you're mitigating bias when people actually get to the company and you're evaluating their performance. Similarly, what is it that you're looking for at a specific level? Are you giving people the same feedback that you're giving other people? For example, we oftentimes see women getting feedback about their personality, and men get a lot less personality feedback. And it's oftentimes negative personality criticism that doesn't have anything to do with how work actually gets done at the company. And so focusing your feedback specifically on what it takes for work to get done as opposed to someone's personality.
So this is a good way to ensure that there's a standardized process throughout the entire search. So standardizing the hiring process refers to creating a clearly mapped out set of tasks for candidates, as well as hiring teams to ensure that all involved understand what to expect throughout the hiring cycle. It also helps to mitigate bias and misunderstanding in the hiring process. And it starts with the need to acquire talent to subsequently post a job posting by creating and using a job description as a guide. So the job description allows candidates to see themselves in the role by painting a picture of what our teachers do and how they do it. What do we visualize for this role? And taking that vision to craft a job description, including highlighting our values boldly and the competencies of an ideal candidate. Inclusive hiring committees. So we also want to ensure we have inclusive hiring committees, and with that, calibrating hiring tools such as this presentation, the talent acquisition guide, and the kickoff meeting with all hiring team members to check for understanding, minimize bias, and to ensure a fair and similar candidate experience for all interviewees. Resume review. So, create aligned materials and rubric for resumes look-fors, phone look-fors, demo lesson look-fors, and interview look-fors is critical in cultivating a fair and equitable process. The hiring rubrics and questions should be done collaboratively as a hiring committee team. The phone screening is also called the blind screening interview, and it is an instrument in fostering a diverse and inclusive school environment by focusing on candidate skills and qualifications rather than personal characteristics. Sometimes we hear things differently, therefore, the screening should always be conducted in pairs. Demo lesson. So, demo lessons are considered performance based assessments, and it's a great way to gauge candidate strengths and areas for improvement ahead of making the final hiring decision. But there are some questions to consider as we go through the demo task. How does the candidate demonstrate cultural responsiveness? How do they encourage students to relate content to their own cultural context? How does the candidate communicate the lesson objective? How does the candidate meet the needs of diverse learners? How effectively do they establish rapport with students and engage them in the learning process? Reference checks. So, reference checks is one of the most important steps in the hiring process because it is usually the only part that involves people other than the candidates that can offer pointed behavioral specific feedback. References should be current and previous managers or someone who is familiar with the candidate's work experience and performance. A general guide is to conduct 3 reference checks for the successful candidate before extending an offer to hire. And then final offer. So once all interviews have been completed, the search committee should meet to express their recommendation with the hiring manager. And using the compensation data provided by the director of finance, the head of school will contact the finalists and negotiate an offer. And then lastly, the evaluation process. So the evaluation of the search and selection is crucial for ensuring the goals and outcomes of the search process have been met. The evaluation is an effective way to ensure bias and barriers that have been prevented that may have prevented diverse candidates from applying or being hired are identified and or eliminated from the process. The evaluation is also an effective way to improve processes, attract diverse and qualified candidates, enhance the candidate's experience, increase efficiency, reduce turnover, and increase diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging here at Key. So let's dive into resume review and bias. So resume bias is the practice of making judgment about a job candidate based on factors other than their qualifications, skills, and experience. So some common bias are one, names. So according to a study published by Harvard Business Review, when all else is identical, resumes with distinctively Black names receive only 1/3 of callbacks when compared to distinctively white names. Title. Not all titles are the same, nor is the access to those titles. Therefore, titles are biased. For example, women are promoted far less than male counterparts, people of color, people with certain disabilities. This doesn't mean those who have the right titles aren't necessarily good candidates, but it does mean that there are likely a lot more candidates in that pool that do deserve the title as well. Address. So address can play a role in the resume review. Some things that A bias that people are thinking of is this person is on the other side of town. They aren't going to want to commute to our school. Addresses can also give away to social economic information and cause cultural assumptions. Years of experience can also trigger age bias. There are too many or too few years of experience, and that triggers assumptions about the person's preferences, stamina, capabilities, and worth. Education can also trigger bias. Preferences towards higher ranking or specific school as bias. These preferences don't result in better candidates, but they do introduce social economic bias. And in summary, while resumes provide a lot of information, they also open the hiring process to an endless stream of bias triggers. So awareness helps, especially to not make assumptions during the resume review.
Ooh, that was a lot, Natalie. So now that we know what we need to be careful for, let's talk about some things that we can do to make sure we're not doing those things. Um, so one of a big responsibility for the hiring manager is making sure that they are laying the groundwork for an equitable process for all of the resumes that are being reviewed by the committee. How can you do that? And you can do that by creating a rubric, and that's going to help mitigate the bias. So the hiring manager, you're going to shepherd this process in helping to define what that role is. You're going to get information from your team, and you are going to weigh all of the evidence to make the final decision by having the rubric as your guide. So when creating a rubric, it's important to think of those must-have skills or those things that you're looking for. So what are the ones that are non-negotiable for the role, and how will you know when you see them? So, for example, this rubric was created by Kristen Addison, and if you look at where it says evidence of customer service experience, there are a couple of different ways that we can see that. And so it could be through administrative or office work, restaurant service, or other customer service arenas. The important thing is to know that skills are transferable, and you need to be looking for the skills instead of specific words or titles or phrases that we tend to think of we're just looking for this, when in reality, this can be found in many different capacities. So what are those skills that you're looking for, and how will you know when you see them? It's really important to make sure that you're clear on what the rating scale means. So up there at the top, you can see that if you're looking through a resume and you don't see any evidence at all of any of these things, then you're going to put a 1 in the category. If you're seeing some evidence, you'll give it a 2. And if there's strong evidence, you give it a 3. Then it's really important in the resume part that you're taking the notes down so that when you do have the conversation after reviewing lots of different resumes, you can remember why you gave that person a 1, 2, or a 3. It's also really important not to share your ratings before everyone has had an opportunity to rate the candidate themselves, because you don't want to be influenced by the way that other people rated it. And you can have a conversation based on what you thought, and perhaps someone's going to change your mind, but that gives you the opportunity to be able to ask questions and really talk through what you initially thought and the candidate. So that leads us to talk about the importance of note-taking. So the focus should be entirely on what you can see and what you can hear, without incorporating your personal interpretations, judgments, or emotional reactions. This type of observation is often called descriptive observation, as it relies solely on factual, observable data. So why is that important? When you stick to observable facts, that makes your notes less biased than if you're just writing anything you want, see, feel, think. And it can serve as a reliable basis for you when you look back at your notes, for you to reflect on the feedback and analysis of the moment. It also allows others to interpret the data without being influenced by your personal views. So this approach is particularly valuable when you're observing lessons for professional development and evaluations, not just during the hiring process, but as we evaluate teachers for years to come. Not just teachers, all of us. We all need a type of evaluation. So what can you do? You can record verbatim phrases. So you write down specific words or phrases spoken by the teacher and student. Some people do this by writing T for teacher and S for student, and then whatever they say, they write it down word for word what the teacher or the student said. It's also important to describe actions, document what individuals are doing without interpreting their intent, and using neutral language. So if the teacher asks a question, you could write down how many students raised their hand to respond to that question. Notice environmental factors. So include details about the seating that might influence the lesson. Rows being set up versus kids sitting in a group, that's going to change the experience of the lesson. So to remember that happened, so that while you're analyzing the data, that is a point of consideration. And it's also important to record timelines and track when things happen to provide a clear sequence of events. Sometimes people, while they're writing down their notes, will mark down at 5-minute intervals. Other people, because it's important, if someone is teaching a lesson and they're spending 45 minutes on the opening, that's useful information. And so it's really important to also timestamp what it is that you are seeing. What not to do. So really throwing in your personal reactions. Avoid phrases like, I think the students are bored, or I feel the teacher is rushing. Judgments, such as good or bad, or the teacher did an excellent job of explaining the fractions. And last but not least, inferences. Don't guess at the motives or emotions, such as the student raised their hand because they were confident. We don't know that. And so just stick to what you can hear and see, and not make it about your personal reactions, judgments, or inferences. All right, so now that we have talked about some things you can do, let's talk about probably the hardest part about all of this is making the unconscious conscious. So bias has been mentioned and will continue to be mentioned because that's what prevents us from being who we believe ourselves to be. I don't think anyone is here because they want their bias to dictate who becomes a member of our community. But there is a freedom in knowing that you don't know what you don't know. And so it's really important for us to think about and reflect, what are those things that get in the way of me being able to look at a person and not let the things that I believe get in the way of whether that person would be good at their role, and not because I'm a biased individual. So let's watch this clip.
What would the world look like if everybody were aware of the stereotypes that they have and the biases that they have? When we talk about unconscious bias, we're basically saying our worldview can actually exert an influence beyond our conscious awareness, and it creates ambiguity.
You go to an engineer who's built something extremely innovative, and you say, who do you think your user is? This is where I have the most fun. My name is TB Raman, and I led our work on Android accessibility for 3 years. Write down everything that you think you know about your user with respect to abilities, inabilities, special abilities, disabilities. Almost every assumption that you write down on that whiteboard about this is the user I think I'm building for is questionable, because our various unconscious biases define the boundaries you're unwilling to expand.
These biases, they're the shortcuts that our brain has created so that we can deal with the information that we process every single day.
Right when we see anyone, whether we think about it or not, we are implicitly, automatically making judgments about how warm and competent that person or thing is.
All humans need to make decisions, and so we fill in the blanks because our brains are wired to do that, and we fill in with things we don't know with, past experience. Oh, you pattern map to someone I think I should hire, so I'm going to hire you versus this person because they didn't map, because I can't fill in the blank because they don't look like me, or they're not from my same background, and so I can't see how they're going to make the jump.
Every single person is great at things that you may not expect them to be, but it's really hard for us to see that when we're so powerfully guided by the things we expect to be true in the world.
I grew up surrounded with this conversation about what you can't do and what you won't be able to do. My name's Enrico, and I'm an autistic software engineer. The first time I go through the performance review process, I was asked for 5 strengths. It was the first time that I had ever been prompted to think in that way about myself, and it was really a life-changing moment for me.
When we are working in our day-to-day jobs, we are still making judgments about the people around us, about the resumes we see, about the employees that we're trying to decide, whether to put them on teams or not.
People are very wedded to the idea that they can perceive something objectively, and statistically they're wrong, but it's hard. You become attached to this idea that you can assess something by looking at it.
These subtle assumptions we make about people can have lasting effects on who we're promoting, who we're hiring, who we're putting in leadership positions. We have the responsibility to understand the assumptions that we make and understand the errors that we make.
But it's not just for the collective good. If you take the time to understand more about this, there are things that you can implement for yourself that'll help you develop as a leader and to do your job even better.
It made me realize how often I have a very strong belief that is simply incorrect. When I look at one of these evaluation situations, the first question is, how can I eliminate the sources of potential bias and leave just the data so we can actually make better decisions?
If you're not conscious of the biases that you have, you're just not contributing at the level that you could, and you're not innovating at the level you could. And so your products won't be as good. Your results won't be as good.
When you think outside the box with respect to the assumptions you made about how somebody would use this wonderful thing you built, and when you sort of broaden that perspective as to who you change the world for, you build something even bigger.
Thank you, Vanessa. So what are we ultimately looking for? I just love this framework. Good for the role, good for the community, bad for the role, bad for the community. So when we observe and assess candidates to make an informed decision to hire, we want to make sure that they are both for the role, good for the role, and good for the community. And ideally, the top half is what we want to cheer and support. We want to hire someone who is performing their assigned responsibilities well and also contributing positively to the overall well-being of the school's core values and mission. Good for the community and bad for the role. So here we're gauging if there's a potential to grow someone in this role, what skills can be taught in the role, and what are the must-haves, particularly if the candidate is mission aligned and continue to move us forward. Bad for the community and good for the role. So this is meaning they have all the skills and can bring a huge amount of depth and knowledge to the role, but they are not mission aligned or doesn't possess a curiosity to learn and grow. The impact of this is that they jeopardize our community simply because it's good for the role. But we have to ask the question, are the values, core values aligned? Hence, how can you be good for the role if you have a negative impact on the community? And then lastly, we want to steer clear of bad for the role and bad for the community, as these candidates can have a negative impact on the overall direction and mission of the school.
All right, so biases. A lot of people think of unconscious bias, and yes, but there's so many types of biases that are out there that we have to be on the lookout for. And there are things that we can do to mitigate those things. So conformity bias, that is when you are feeling peer pressure to make a certain decision because of the other people. And I'll give you an example of how I saw this in a very real way in 6th grade when I was in 6th grade. So there was a teacher that we had, and every year, a couple of times a year, he was infamous for doing a social experiment on us. And he would send a child out of the classroom, and then the kids that were left behind, he would say, I'm going to ask this question and I need you to answer it in this way. And so then when the student would come back, he would then proceed in the experiment. So one day I was sent out of the classroom on an errand. And when I came back, he asked the class, would you all like to stay in and keep working, or would you like to go out to recess early? And when he gave the options, and it was, would you like to stay and keep working, without hesitation, every single child in that classroom raised their hand. And I was looking around the room very confused as to why my classmates wanted to stay and continue to work versus go outside and play. And so I looked around, I was really confused. And then I was the only one with my hand down, and I slowly started to raise my hand in voting to stay in and do work versus go outside and play. And that they all started laughing at me. And you always think, no, I won't be the person. I will hold true to what I want and what I believe. But conformity bias is real, and you can get influenced by those people around you. Once I was listening to an episode of Brene Brown podcast, and she talked about how when she's making decisions with the team of people at her work, she asks a question and then she'll have everybody write down their response on a note card. And then on the count of 3, they turn it over to see what everybody else had said or voted for, so that they would not be influenced by one another, but then could actually have a conversation based on what people wanted or believed or had voted for. So we also have beauty bias, and beauty bias is that, and the important thing to note is that standards of beauty are different. And so what one person believes is beautiful might not be the same, and usually there's a lot of correlation to culture in terms of what is beautiful or not beautiful, and so it's really important that we don't make decisions on whether someone can do their job based on how they look. And oftentimes people tend to gravitate towards giving people the benefit of the doubt if they think they're beautiful. So, I encourage you not to do that. So, affinity bias. Natalie's going to give us a story about how affinity bias can show up.
So, affinity bias can show up. So, let me give you a personal story. So, my daughters, they used to take swim lessons. And when I would go to watch them swim, there would be a group of parents. And people who are like, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, they usually group together. And there were commonality, because of the commonalities, they were able to open up, be transparent, share. And that may be okay in the outside world, but when it comes to hiring practices, that does not work. And the reason why is because you can hire someone based on the affinity bias, meaning based on similarities or similarities in experiences or the way they look, that you can hire someone who is not good for the role. And on the contrary, you can not hire someone who could be good for the role. So you definitely want to be mindful of that when you get into the hiring process.
So then there is a phenomenon called the halo effect and the horn effect. So the halo effect is when you have a positive impression on someone in a certain area, and then that influences everything else. While the opposite, the opposite is the horn effect, where one bad quality distorts your impression of the entire person. Where we have to be really careful and mindful about this is with internal candidates in particular, because we can have preconceived notions about these individuals. So whatever it is that we think to be true does not mean that they will or will not be effective at their role. And so it's really important for us to make sure that we are giving them the process that we would of anybody else, based on the skills and then how they demonstrate their performance during the evaluation process.
So we talked a bit about common biases that can arise during the search process. Now let's talk about how a bias can turn into discrimination. In this part of the presentation, we'll talk about what questions and what categories employers are not allowed to ask. The reason we are not allowed to ask these questions because they violate protected information for protected classes. And it's about a couple of things. One, protecting against discrimination from the school, from federal and state employment laws. And also, we are not allowed to ask these questions because it goes against who we are as a school and our core values of fostering a community of inclusivity from the start of an employee's journey. Here are the top questions we should not be asking during an interview of any candidate. And I strongly recommend to read the talent acquisition guidelines for a greater scope of all these questions you should not ask candidates. But let's go through the most prevalent questions you should steer clear of. So 1, questions about race, religion, or ethnicity. We should not ask any candidate questions about their race, religion, or ethnicity. When it comes to nationality or homeland, however, we may ask, are you authorized to work in the United States? However, this is a question that is asked during the application process. Questions about age, unless used to verify that applicants meet a particular age-related legal requirement for the job. For instance, some positions or some jobs requires that an employee must be a certain age, such as 18 years or older. So you may ask the question of, do you meet this age requirement? Questions about an applicant's pregnancy or plans to start a family, or asking about kids or babysitting, or directly, are you going to be pregnant? You definitely want to stay clear of these questions as it can lead to discrimination against someone's marital status, sexual preferences, and gender discrimination. And then lastly, questions about an applicant's disability or questions that are likely to reveal whether an applicant has a disability. However, you can ask, will you need a reasonable accommodation to do the job? this particular question is asked in the application process, such as your nationality or homeland. So you want to focus on abilities, not disabilities, when evaluating candidates with disabilities. The primary focus should be are their abilities, skills, and qualifications relevant to the job. Avoid making assumptions about what they can or cannot do based on their disability and any other unique quality that makes up someone's identity, such as race, age, gender, and sexual orientation.
So now we're going to move to the portion of what are these red flags that we need to watch out for. And we're just going to go over some examples so that you have them front and center as you begin this process. So a red flag would be if you have a lack of diversity on the hiring committee. And remember that earlier on in the presentation, we gave recommendations for how to ensure that you have a diverse hiring committee. Because the truth of the matter is you can't see what you don't know. And that's why representation matters, so that we can help see the things that some of us have a harder time seeing. It's also really important to have a diverse hiring committee to ensure that the lack of representation in either your divisions or your departments move beyond what they are to become more diverse. And so it's really important to move beyond your limits and your comfort zone. And sometimes that can be really hard to do if you're surrounded by individuals that are not representing some of our groups that are not represented, specifically in a division or a department. And then we really have to watch out for our affinity biases, because sometimes what we end up doing unconsciously is continue to hire iterations of ourselves. And that is not what we as a school are choosing to do. And so remember that in the process and really kind of push yourself. And part of how you can do that is by ensuring diversity on your hiring committee.
So another red flag is skipping the process. So skipping the process, particularly when there are time constraints and other demands and priorities, can lead us into hiring candidates who are not good for the role nor for the community. The key is to start the process as early as possible, particularly once we know that there is a need for a position. So we would definitely want to start that process as early as possible. And this can also foster an efficient structured process and eliminate bias, errors, and we don't feel that pinch to hire someone immediately. It can also help us in attracting a great pool of viable candidates. Again, trust the process, the impact will pay off.
So another area that we need to be careful of is when there is a lack of diversity in the finalist pool. And sometimes that shows up. Natalie just talked about trusting the process. And sometimes when we settle, that's when we end up getting a lack of diversity in our finalist pool. Another way that can happen is we're not making it a priority. Hearing statements like "we're good on DEI" is a red flag, and so really making sure that we are prioritizing, making sure that our students have access to windows and mirrors. And last but not least, subjectivity. This has to do with once again, a little bit going back to the idea of settling. We have someone that's good for the role. We can compromise on someone who's good for the community. And that can lead to us making decisions that leave out diverse finalists. And that's a very big red flag. Another red flag is getting into the mindset that cultural responsiveness somehow compromises on talent. That being a culturally responsive individual within our community, that would be nice. It's not a must. It's an add-on when, if DEI is truly the fabric of all that we do, then it is not an add-on or a would be nice. One cannot exist without the other. And so it's really important to have that mindset as we go into the hiring process.
So, talking about mindset, a fixed mindset is another red flag. Without mindfulness of our language, how we communicate, and how we approach candidates in the process, it can result in a narrow and less diverse talent pipeline applying for our open roles. And that's a really important consideration of all the steps in the recruiting process, from how we communicate the job descriptions to one-on-one interactions with candidates. And how we talk about talent, skills, and development plays a significant role in who applies to work for our school. Leading with a fixed mindset can even result in talent self-selecting out of the application process. This is especially relevant for certain demographic groups, usually those who are already most underrepresented. Therefore, mindset is everything. You want to lead with a growth mindset and look for candidates who also possess these traits.
All right, so now that we've talked about red flags, we're going to leave you with just the highlights of the best practices that we have talked about so far. Hold on, we're having technical. Okay, there we go. We fixed it. So one of the best practices we really, really want you to walk away with is non-negotiable having a culturally competent hiring panel. And in fact, I would change that word competent to responsive or humble, culturally humble hiring panel. That's another way of looking at it as well. This is very important. We have given you tips that you can rewatch. Also, the Talent Acquisition Guide has a great section in ensuring that you have what it is to look for when creating a hiring panel. And also know that is what Natalie and I are here for, is to support you if you're feeling stuck. We're your thought partners, because we want to set you up for success. And so please don't forget to use us as a resource. Also, best practice, indicating the role of the committee members. Something that Natalie and I have created this year to help hold all of us accountable is an inclusive hiring committee timeline and tracker. And on this, you're able to indicate who are the members of your hiring panels and what specific roles they have. Remember, we're really looking to understand who is that hiring manager, clerk, in addition to who is your DEI advocate. And your DEI advocate is someone who has received training. This can't just be made by the hiring manager, nor can the hiring manager be the DEI advocate. So that needs to be a conversation to ensure that we do have someone who has been trained to be a DEI advocate. Ensuring that all members are involved in the search process. This is a heavy lift, and when we're going through this process, it's really important to be part of the process because you're taking into account all of the information that you have. And if you're coming in and out of the process, it's really hard for you to know what is happening. It also allows people to kind of pick up the lift in certain areas while other people support, and then vice versa. You can share that because it is a lot of work.
Standardize the process. So standardizing and structuring the process from start to finish is super important. And it also helps to mitigate bias and misunderstanding in the hiring process.
don't forget, especially when it comes to the resume portion of your of the screening, what are your must-haves and what are your look-fors? You want to have about 3 to 5 must-haves, because that is all of you being on the same page of what a qualified candidate looks for, to try to mitigate the biases for what we as individuals are looking for. A consensus around and an understanding of what is really important in order for someone to be able to do this position successfully. And then what are those things that might be nice, but they're not the non-negotiables. Using a hiring rubric to mitigate bias. This is something that, once again, if you need support, Natalie and I are here to help you. We have many examples of rubrics that can be used, and these are crucial in terms of understanding what it is that you're looking for. When you go into these interviews and these meetings, it is really important to all be really kind of thinking critically and intentionally about those must-haves and look-fors, and you find them in the rubrics that you create. The importance of note-taking, once again, don't forget, it's really important. What are you seeing and what are you hearing? This isn't the space for judgment and interpretation and opinions. This is really just kind of documenting what it is that you see and hear. The other thing is a red flag. I'm going to go just 1 second back to red flags. If you are not taking notes during any of this process, my question to you is, how can you honestly remember what it is that you heard and saw, without kind of filtering it through your lens? And so don't forget to take notes. It's important to write down what you're hearing and you're seeing, but more important than that, write notes. Debrief and use a scoring system in a timely manner. The other thing that ends up happening is, if you have a lot of candidates, it can all become a jumble in your head. And so that's why the notes are really important. And that's also why it's really important for you to be able to provide your feedback on the candidate, really about 24 hours after you have interviewed them or observed a lesson, because then they are fresh in your head and you're not comparing them to someone who came before or after them. And another part of that also is, you're doing this process on your own. You should not be doing it as a group, because you don't want that conformity bias that we talked about earlier. So be sure that we're prioritizing candidates who have skills that the school needs and lacks. Depending on where you are in the school, the division or the department, we're just looking for a greater representation. Just look around you, who's already there and who can enhance that role by providing something that is missing within that space. Expecting cultural responsive evidence from everyone. And I really want to take us back to the question of, how can you be good for the role if you are not good for the community? And that is definitely going to show up during this process, and really kind of making sure that we are adding people to our team that are going to join us and continue on in the journey that we're on.
References. So references is super important, and it matters. It's important to obtain feedback from past employers and those who have worked closely with the candidate. And remember, references should be conducted in pairs. So sometimes we hear different things, even at different times. And so it's so important to ensure that when we are conducting the reference checks, that we have a partner in that process.
Don't settle. Trust the process. Sometimes we're feeling the pinch of the timeline, wanting to ensure that we get someone into a position without really worrying or considering that person that we're putting into that position, because hopefully they're going to stay and be part of this community for a while. The other thing to consider is that putting someone into the position that we just settled for could lead to higher turnover rate. And there is a cost to looking for a new person in a position, upwards of $20,000. So right now, it's really important for us to consider who is it that we want in this position in the long term. Also, it's really important to acknowledge and address power dynamics on a committee. So basically, what this means is acknowledge the elephant in the room, remove the elephant, or at the very least, give that elephant a name so that you're all very clear on the power dynamics within the committee.
Transparency. So remember, transparency builds trust, and that trust should be fostered at the beginning of the employee's journey with us. That is during the hiring phase. It's important to be open, honest, and clear in both our interactions with candidates and the way we communicate. And lastly, review the talent acquisition guide for further resources and guidance. So utilize the talent acquisition guide. It's really a comprehensive guide that will help you as you navigate through the process. And also know that Vanessa and I, we're here to support you to make this an efficient and successful process as you go through your hiring season.
So, friends, we have reached the end, and we hope that you enjoyed that presentation. Luckily, you can go back and rewatch it as many times as you'd like. Yep. We can also send the slides if you request them so that you can use them as a reference point, along with the talent acquisition guide. So what we are asking of you, we understand that some of you are already in the process of hiring. So this is something that for those of you, we're asking to complete as soon as you can. For everyone else, we're asking you to have completed this before you start the process. But here's an exit ticket. If you scan the QR code, we're just going to ask you to reflect and kind of create some intentions about what you're hoping moving forward with this hiring process. So thank you for taking the time to listen, and good luck with this hiring season.
Thank you.
So this video is going to help ground us in the why of what we're doing this hiring season. And it is going to talk to us about why having teachers of color is so crucial.
Teachers of color are underrepresented in the U.S. workforce and leave the profession at a higher rate than their white peers. The primary reasons cited: isolation and a lack of support. But having teachers of color yields positive outcomes for all students. They force classrooms to break down negative stereotypes, help students understand and confront racism, and prepare students to live in a multicultural society. And for many students of color, it can be life-changing. A 2018 study found that Black students who had a single Black teacher were 13% more likely to enroll in college. With 2 Black teachers, that number jumps to 32%. For Black boys, the impact is even more powerful. Having a Black teacher cut high school dropout rates by 39% for Black boys from low-income families. It's not just because they are seeing a role model who looks like them, though the research says that does matter. Compared to their white counterparts, Black teachers have higher expectations for Black students, and they're less likely to perceive Black students as disruptive, inattentive, or unable to do homework. So there's a gap in representation, and it's holding all of our students back. The demographic data reveals the scope of the problem. Nearly 80% of U.S. teachers are white, but a majority of students are children of color. We must do the hard work of addressing the diversity problem in our teaching workforce. Students need to see their own cultures reflected in the adults responsible for their learning.